Hello, everyone. Once again, good to see so many of you. And I'll quickly take a minute to revise. It always helps to keep bringing the attention back to the focus. We talked about the era, which is the brand DNA, the exceptionalness, rarity, and authenticity. We talked about the muse and the consumer orbits. We talked about the resultant value proposition for this muse and how you go about determining your value market fit. Now, once you have done that, what you typically do is the first step you do in building the more complete business model is a holistic design over covering your product, your distribution and channels, your communication and marketing, your revenue model, your pricing, etc., and your cost model. And all these things actually get represented by your brand identity. So whatever your brand identity is, whatever your brand represents, is a sum total of all these things. And this is what you hope that the customer will experience completely and in totality, without any perception gap, right? But we also spoke about the difference between the brand identity, which is in the mind of the brand manager, and the brand perception. There could be a difference. Although every brand manager's task, every brand's task is to keep that difference to zero or negligible. Because as we spoke, the brand perception of the consumer is experienced through all these stages, right? This is just a quick revision from what we covered last session. And what helps you to deliver on this promise to the consumers again and again and again is your backend, which actually is a function of people, the capabilities, the technology, the processes, all the optimizations, et cetera, and the resources, the capital resources. And all the things come together to form a business model. So it's actually pretty straightforward. Know your consumer, know your era, know who you want to target, therefore, and what will connect with them, how will they connect with them, and make sure that that delivery is holistic and consistent at a profitable cost structure of business model, right? Now, if that be the case, a question that we were discussing about the Start Soper last time. So the question is, how did the Start Soper actually deliver on their promise? Okay, so the first thing, please remember that their consumer is really the Austrian society. That's the muse. And the state, which actually gives them the subsidy, represents the society. So their exceptionalness, their value proposition, their business model, therefore, is all constructed and all comes together on serving that bit of stakeholders. So what is their exceptionalness? Nurturing talent. It's not acquisition of superstars. It's nurturing talent to produce amazing performances. What's a rarity? Of course, as we read from the case as well, their place in the Austrian social and political fabric is undisputable. It's got a preeminent place. And the authenticity comes from the fact that it's seen by people as a national symbol, which is why even a taxi driver would be keeping abreast of the critiques and the latest productions. because they see it as a national symbol. And if there is a tourist coming in, it's upon them to even communicate about, even if the visitor is unable to step inside the Staatsoper, they hear enough stories about it. So that's a very, very important element of understanding what their era is. And the value proposition, therefore, that flows from there is a wide range of highly acclaimed productions leading to further growth of new generation of artists. We saw that already. It's actually a line written in the case. Now, if this be the case, let's just see how did they deliver on it. I'm not going to touch upon everything, but just the highlights of the business model, okay, on how this translated into a business model, okay? And what we will do is compare it with the Met. The interesting thing is that they have similar product, but just because the value market fit is different, their muses are different, their eras are different, their business models are different. And that's a very important point I wanted to drive home. Similar products, 10 people with similar products can have 10 different business models suited to their value market fit. Okay, so let's see the key differences. Right? Number one, you have state subsidies versus donations from wealthy patrons. Very clearly a function of the main stakeholders, which is a function of who their customer is, whom they are in this business of keeping satisfied. And the state subsidies, as we spoke about, they're representing the Austrian society. Immediate difference. The Staatsoper nurtures talent. They may actually hire them young, train them, versus the Met, which will be hiring the superstars. A ticket average of 65 euros for the Staatsoper versus the Met average of $135. Now, this I'm talking about the average. I don't know, but my hypothesis would be that the difference between the most expensive and the cheapest prices at the Staatsoper will be far more than it would be at the Met. And of course, the big difference on how this translates into the repertory versus the Stagione model. What are the differences? How they translate? And what do they mean for the business model? Quick recap. So how do I arrive at this fixed cost of 80 euros? You can see in the exhibit that there are fixed costs given at 72 of employee cost, 72 million. And you had another 7 million or 7.5 million or 2 million almost of depreciation of fixed costs, of fixed assets. The marginal costs were actually just 21 million. Do you have these numbers in front of you? Do you recall? And the marginal income that we saw from the ticket sales was 38 million, right? So in the repertory model, the marginal income is more than the marginal cost because most of the cost is fixed. On the other hand, look at the Met. The Met, I mean, let's make, we don't have the detail, but let's make a very simple assumption that the fixed costs were negligible or nothing. And the total operating budget, and this is what we mean by the operating budget. The operating budget means the budget available for operations was given as 325 million. Now, these are both not-for-profit organizations, so much easier to calculate the numbers. We don't have to worry about the profits. So the costs being 325, they were marginal costs, which means that every time they did a fresh production, they would then hire the cast, then hire the orchestra, go about the production, and everything would be, like a variable cost, a marginal cost. And the marginal income, as we could see, is, it states that 35% of the total budget was served by the ticket sales, which comes to roughly about 114 million euros, which is significantly lower than the marginal cost of 325. Now, what does this mean? There is a line that explains in the case, but perhaps it was missed or not very well understood. I would like to take a minute to explain that. What it means is that there was a certain subsidy available to the Staatsoper to cover all the costs. And this subsidy was irrespective of the number of performances, which means that there was a motivation for the Staatsoper to maximize the capacity. Because you see, every time they did a new performance, they made an additional revenue. As you can see, the marginal income is more than marginal cost, which permitted them actually to reach 98-99% of the capacity, because they could do so many performances without a problem. And they could do a performance almost every day, on an average, 363. Versus Met. Why is their capacity utilization only 78%? You think people are not interested? You think they are going empty-seated? No. They're not able to do more performances. If they did more than 286 performances, their capacity utilization will be more. But why were they not able to do more performances? Because they ran out of the money. So the available grant to them, which was roughly around 236 million, which is the endowment, could be used for only 286 performances. Then it got finished. So which means that if they had more endowment, they could perhaps do more performances. But doing more performances alone is not going to help them, because their marginal income is very, very low. And they have to pay to their actors, to the orchestra for the sets every time they do a new performance. Okay, so a quick recap. The difference between fixed cost and marginal cost, which actually translated into on how they could generate the revenue, how many performances they could actually do, how many premieres and totally new productions they could actually perform in a year. So for example, the Staatsoper could perform 64 different performances, of which 8 of them were fresh productions, premieres, versus the Met, which could actually do much fewer. What did the general manager do to increase the capacity, the velocity? And this is what we mean by making changes when he came on to manage the Staatsoper. What did Meyer do? Number one, he increased the capacity by creating the second stage, as we spoke about last time. He negotiated 20% additional rehearsing time, but he did something else very interesting, which is the decision to co-produce the new productions. Now, what did that do? That actually created, freed up certain amount of budgets, which would have gone fully into new productions. It freed up that budget to, to renew the old productions, which meant they could actually perform more old productions, and they could produce more of new productions as well. So earlier they could do only 5 or 6, now they were able to do 8. So it's just creating that resource velocity. And we spoke about the business model, one of the critical elements being asset reallocation. Things you can do already from whatever is available to you without any additional resources. So what does these respective business models mean? Number one, that while the Met cannot do more performances until they find new sources of income or additional endowment, the Staatsoper is limited by its capacity. It doesn't have more capacity, otherwise they could have performed more and they could have earned more money, because it would not be costing them significant fixed cost. Their marginal income is more than the marginal cost. So every time they perform, they will earn net income, net contribution, but they can't because they've reached their full capacity. So this is also very important to sort of understand when looking at the digital model. So all these elements are important. Now, what has happened currently?
I had a question on this, like fixed cost versus marginal cost. The Stagione, why is the marginal cost superior to fixed cost? I mean, like, why is that fixed cost is more prominent in repertory, where you have to employ everyone from inside or outside the organization? Stagione is like you have to any geographical area which is there, the institutes can come from there. So how come the fixed costs are more prominent in repertory?
See, what it basically means is that it costs a lot of money to produce and perform. And this money for opera productions, just from ticket sales, cannot be covered. This is a basic fact. Now, given that, there are two different models of repertory versus stagione. Now, you asked me the question about stagione and why it cannot cover. The basic truth is that to produce and perform an opera is a lot of money. If you make a quick calculation, it's almost $1 million for one performance.
Okay.
Now, the total revenue that you're actually it's more than $1 million. Very simply because, for example, you did 286 productions.
Yes.
Right? For 325 million euros. That was your budget.
Euros, okay.
Yeah, $325 million. So that means that it was almost about 1.2, 1.25. I mean, I'm not making exact calculation. $1 million for each performance.
Okay.
Now, the key difference between stagione and repertory is that in stagione model, you hire the talent and the sets, etc., for each production, each performance freshly. So you don't pay nobody's on a salary.
Okay.
Okay, that means that for each performance, the cost of delivery is far, 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 far more.
Oh, so the marginal cost will be higher in Stagione.
Much, much higher. So while it's costing 1.25 million dollars, the revenue that you on an average get from ticket sale is only 114 million divided by 286. Now what is happening is that um, all the other the value proposition, the original value proposition, which is to have a wide range of highly acclaimed performances while growing new generation of artistic talent, there's an additional demand from the society on the Staatsoper, which is access to the Staatsoper for the entire Austrian population, and two, financial independence. As we saw that the state is burdened and they need to reduce their subsidy, which cannot happen unless the Staatsoper is able to gain more and more of its revenue from the ticket sales. But what was happening? What is happening is that there is a limit to the capacity at the Staatsoper. So it cannot sell any more tickets because it cannot perform anymore. It doesn't have room to perform anymore. So with these two additional value proposition needs or objectives, what will Staatsoper go about doing? There are opportunities as well as demands, which is they have to reach new markets. They have to reach new consumer orbits, maybe the amateurs more prominently now, particularly through digital, where, in an opera house, you might get a seat with just half visibility, where, so many of the spectators would be actually carrying binoculars because they can barely see. And yet the experience is something else, of course. That's why you would still want to be there. But the digital can enhance the experience. That's something that a live cannot. So what can those experiences be? Is there an opportunity to provide those experiences that a live performance actually cannot? You can't replace a live performance. Don't try to. What can you do even more? Think of a sports performance, a live cricket. In a stadium, there's an atmosphere where it gets filled up and there are only so many people who can walk. But when you're watching the same game on your television, the experience is different, but it's also enhanced in many ways. For example, the replays, very simple. And of course, there's an opportunity to earn more revenue. So what were the different options and what was the criteria that the Staatsoper needed to employ in order to make the choice of what they would do? Well, first of all, as was evoked in the case, and I'm taking it more simple at this stage, not going too deep, is the national TV broadcast. That was one option. The Met's cinema model, that was another option. The third option was a free live streaming. And the fourth was a paid live streaming. Now, which one would you have gone about taking? How would you choose which one to go for? And this is why you have a list of criteria. Now, very clearly, the Staatsoper was, bound by the money as a resource available for this venture. So whatever was the choice they would make had to be delivered at the small or no fixed cost, very, very little marginal cost, because both the marginal cost and the fixed cost had to be very low. Most importantly, it could not come into the way of the live performances. So no or least obstruction to live performances. Maximize the viewer experience. Easy and wide access to people at no or least cost. Least financial and reputational risk, and maximize the revenue. Now, very, very complex. They seem to be sort of competing with each other in many ways. But if you were to apply these criteria, 2 or 3 of them actually just fall apart. National TV broadcast, as we already figured, would not really be an option, because they would really not necessarily put it at and give it the most importance. They would give more importance to other things which are commercially more viable. Met's cinema model, would it work? Okay, I'll take some comments here.
Actually, Met cinema model, I'm not aware of Met, but actually, as such, my question was, why would national TV broadcast not be an option?
Anyone else? Why would national TV broadcast not be an option?
Ajay, just shouting it out. I think they need revenue. Hi. I think they're looking at revenue, and I think national TV broadcast has their own mandate, which may not be completely revenue driven. So they need a commercial angle to raise funds and for distribution and reaching a wider network. So therefore, may not be a good idea.
Very true. So revenue objective will not be met, but more importantly, it would be limited to just Austrian audience. Here, if you are going digital, why would you restrict yourself only to the Austrian? Why wouldn't you be able to offer it to a larger audience? Of course, most definitely the Austrian. Because if you see, the objective is also to maximize the revenue. Because just to incur additional costs for very little or no revenue would serve only one of the 2 objectives, which is to reach the Austrian audience more easily, a wider range of Austrian audience. But it's not going to serve the second option at all.
I think Sairi has a comment to make.
Yes.
Go ahead, Sairi.
Hi. So in addition to the national broadcast being only limited to Austrians, the other thing impeding that was it wasn't as revenue generation as other channels, and already they had hundreds of channels to compete with, and that is why it was not a good fit.
Correct. So yeah, we've covered that. Okay, now anyone on what they think about the Met cinema model? By the way, it's described in the case, so I'm not talking about something which you shouldn't already be knowing.
I think Met's cinema model may not be feasible for this scenario because the production cost would be way high in order to make it sort of work in the cinema model. The production setup that would require to produce, document and distribute would needs to be quite high quality So I think, yeah, that's my thinking.
That's absolutely right. The production would be like a fresh production. So there would be performances and performances of performances until it was dead on right. And then canned and then distributed to the different cinema halls. So the production and the distribution costs would be prohibitive and certainly not feasible for the Start Soper. The free live streaming also sort of rules itself out for the same reason that it doesn't serve any revenue objectives. So what did the Start Soper actually end up doing? What it ends up doing is this. They actually started with the smart TV channels with Samsung as the platform technology partner, which meant that the fixed cost was almost zero. Well, actually zero. What they also did was to go for a transparent broadcast model, the live broadcast model, but transparent, which means no additional lighting, no additional, well, the sound systems were already very, very good, but no additional lighting at all, which meant that the streaming audience, even if they had to see a dark stage at points in time, so be it. It was as real as it was. What it enabled them to do is in-house production with very low marginal cost. With just 2,000 euros, they were able to transmit live every new performance. With the help of very, very small cameras. You recall that in the case, Meyer did talk about this being on the cards, on the agenda for a long time, but he felt that the timing was not right because of the bulk of the camera and the kind of lighting you needed, et cetera, the quality of the cameras, the size of the cameras, which would continuously get in the way of the audience watching the live performance. The interesting thing is that, of course, the Start Soper capacity was its peak, but there was super distribution possible through the live streaming model, which was a paid model. They had both single and the subscription revenue model, which means somebody could just pay and watch a single performance, or they could subscribe monthly or annually. So this is actually how they ended up rolling out, which served very, very well both their purposes. Additional revenue and very easy access to the Austrian audience, but even beyond that. And of course, different states, different cantons, they subsidized at their own discretion the subscription to the Start Soper for their local population. But more interesting for me is what it ended up doing for the customer experience. How it served the additional consumer need. Well, first of all, live at home. But very interesting feature they brought in is the time zone shift. Somebody in the US, Australia, completely different time zones. Actually, everyone other than the EU, but some of them really very difficult time zones. But they enable them to sort of watch it kind of live, whatever. So it was still available for streaming for 72 hours. So it just permitted them to create their own prime times wherever they are. Now, this is how they served the physical dimension. The rational was very easy in terms of, for example, the single or the subscription models. We talked about enhancing the experience, which for the amateurs becomes very interesting because they are able to, I'm sorry for the typo in behind the scenes. It's, more learning, more stories, more story building, more emotion building is interesting. Interval interviews also added more, sort of, so it made the stars, made the performance, made the artists more accessible, more human. And you could have a different kinds of sensorial experiences, multi-camera views, close-ups, etc. Some things that the live performances simply can't give. And of course, conversation content with the interval interviews, etc., for the amateurs to project. This actually shows on how it is important to construct the business model to serve your needs. And the needs, your needs are actually the needs to deliver and service the customer. Now, having said that, the important thing next is, in this context of these learning sessions, the embracing the digital. Business modeling in the digital age. For me, it's a very straightforward 3-question process. The why, the how, and the what. The first question, of course, is why. Why digital? And therefore, what is the role of the digital in the business model? Number one, how does it serve the value market fit? Remember, the value market fit is how you bring the value proposition to the intended consumers. So how does it serve? Would it actually transform the product that you're offering? The digital certainly has that capability. Would it help you to serve new markets? Same consumers in new markets, meaning? Would it help you to serve new customer segments, new customer orbits? Reach out to newer orbits. We talked about connoisseurs, amateurs, novices with different needs, different value needs. Digital has a promise to deliver on this, not just sequentially, but in parallel. Would it open new channels for you on how to reach that customer? Would it help you create new back-end processes? Then those back-end processes could be related to any kind of resources, including production, including on how to put the technology together to create performances which you were not able to before, which means that, and perhaps the role of digital increasingly, as we are knowing, as we are seeing, would serve in all these 5 points. So the first question you want to ask yourself is why? And the second question, of course, is how. So, okay, I know why I need it. So now how am I going to deploy it? How would you go about making the decision? We said, look at all the options, look at the criteria, see how the customer experience journey gets enhanced. How are you able to deliver more value? And then before you take a decision, determine whether you have the capability or you need external help to come up with that decision. Now, remember, Meyer, finally, the person that he hired to take on the digital venture or digital vertical at the Start Super had intimate understanding, of course, not just of technology, but the understanding of opera. That's very important. So what capability do you have or you need to acquire to help you go digital? And of course, the right timing of it. Don't be too early, don't be too late. And then the what. And unless you have the right capabilities and the how and the why is in place, you can't come up with what you will actually deploy. The technology mix. And the golden thread alignment, what I mean by golden thread alignment is how it all comes together. The value proposition, your era, the digitalization, the business modeling, the value enhancement to the customers. So that's all as far as the business model aspects are concerned. I would take any critical questions. So reputation risk for Start Super, it was an important criteria, right? How did they manage? How did they manage in the option they chose? Number one, they managed it by ensuring that the integrity of the live performances, both for the live audience present inside the home, as well as for the viewers, is maintained, right? And the second reputational risk that they faced was actually doing nothing, to be seen as having lost the race or not, the inability to keep up with technology. And three, their inability to keep up with the technology business models, which means failure was also not an option. So they had to find something which was least risk financially, least cost, and least intrusive, or the most truant to a live performance. So as we always say, it's never either or, it's always and. It's very tempting. If you are in a hurry, you can choose either or, but to come up with business model solutions to serve two seemingly competing ends or goals is harder, but it's always possible.
Anchal, this is just to learn, in the current context. See, I think the case study is from 2012 and technology is leapfrogged to what it is today. And I just wanted to learn from you, and a lot of these things are outdated now, but will the matrices of the value proposition and the ERA that have been defined on this case still hold true for case studies or for initiatives that one will undertake now this year?
So we could do a similar discussion on the Start Super today, in today's context, but that was not objective. The ERA and the value proposition is eternal. They of course they evolve, as we saw in the case of Start Super. It evolved in 2012, and therefore they took a certain action with the technology available back then. Today, as you say, it's leapfrogged. And as we speak, they're looking at enhancements to their digital strategy. This is a continuous process. So we could have case discussions at any point in time, but important thing is that the learning outcomes are not going to change. Okay, golden thread alignment. is a concept which means that there is a golden thread that runs across everything you do in your organization, from the back end to the front end. And that golden thread is actually, think of it like your breath. Like it runs through nourishing every cell in your body, right? What do you think that golden thread is for any organization?
A golden thread which runs each and every cell from back end to front end in a very enlightening manner, like a value creation from back end, as in I don't understand what all processes are there from back end.
Whatever the processes are, your own business will have 1,000 processes. Different materials coming together, different performers, different creative artists, the director, the sets, the music, etc., and so forth. And then you have to deliver it to the customer, the communication and the channels, etc., and all of that, right? One thing that runs across any business of any nature is your value proposition. And that is like your breath, your DNA. So everything you do in the organization must contribute fully to delivering on the value proposition. That is what we mean by golden thread alignment. Every element, every little link in the whole value chain is coming together to serve the value proposition. Okay? So what we are going to do is switch gears. So please take a deep breath, take a sip of the coffee, and let's switch. Something else which we talk about, cultural distortions, cultural appropriation. So we've seen this, and I just reiterate that the critical question, even before we determine the elements of the business model, is what do we have to offer that people don't already have enough of, and for whom? This is the fundamental question. What do we have to offer that people don't already have enough of? And who are we offering this for? And this is where culture steps in. That uniqueness of your own culture that you can bring to the people. But let's just see it from a very different lens. Let's take the example of Shanghai Tang. But before we do that, what do we mean by culture? And a very interesting definition I read was that culture is myths or imagined realities and behavioral patterns based on such beliefs. I thought it was just so simply explained that it made total sense. It simply means that every culture would view the same things differently, isn't it? Because we have our own imagined realities, own myths, and therefore own beliefs. And we act upon such beliefs, assuming them to be our truth. They are our truth, and this is what makes our culture unique. It also means that our views, our worldly views, are different depending on our own lens, our lens being the culture, our own culture. And this is where cultural distortions actually happen with any cultural good. Let's take an example of Shanghai Tang. And more recently, unfortunately, from an Indian standpoint, we heard the Manish Arora filed for Chapter 11 for bankruptcy after decades of being in the market at the top of his game globally. The first really acclaimed Indian fashion designer. Now, what happens? Why did this even happen? Let's look at Shanghai Tang. I leave you to reflect on Manish Arora on your own, but keep this lens in your focus. Now, ideally, I would have loved you to read this, the case, and we could have discussed this, but it was important enough for me to, instead, I'll just tell you a quick story. So listen to it very carefully. Shanghai Tang, for people who don't know, is a luxury fashion brand founded by David Tang, a Chinese national who actually grew up in the UK, went to public schools there. He left Hong Kong, where he was born, when he was a 14-year-old boy. Could barely speak any English. And he was directly thrown into public school. Very, very privileged, of course, came from one of the wealthiest families in Hong Kong, with multiple interests in different activities. So he founded Shanghai Tang in 1994 when he came back from the UK after finishing his graduate studies and joined the family business. But his interest was more in taking the Chinese culture to the world, with a belief that China was already beginning to be a rising economic power. And it was time that people recognize its cultural power as well. So he believed that, just like him, there were many, many other people, millions of other people across the world who are very, very curious about China, its culture, and therefore ready to accept a Chinese luxury brand. So with this thought, he started Shanghai Tang in Hong Kong, the first store, very large format store in Central, very centrally located, beautiful store, very, very luxury store, really. It was a runaway success. And within that first year of operation hadn't been out. And Richemont, a quickly recall, is one of the three main luxury conglomerates. Number one being LVMH, Kering, and then Richemont. Some of the brands that Richemont owns is Christian Dior, Van Cleef & Arpels, Piaget, etc., Montblanc, etc. And here is a completely new store, and Richemont acquired a controlling stake in the business for $32 million for a startup. One store, not even 1 year of operation, but such was the frenzy around Shanghai Tang. It was also the first time that any one of the big three, LVMH, Kering, or Richemont, actually acquired a startup business. Their typical business model otherwise was to buy globally successful luxury brands and then nurture them from connoisseur and amateur orbits to the novice orbit, and grow rapidly with rapid profitability. Now, in 1997, again, buoyed by the enormous success of the Hong Kong store, which continued to do well, In 1997, they opened a store at Madison Avenue in New York. And look at just the whole background, right? You have Richemont, one of the world's best known luxury conglomerate. They have the best of the talent. They have the best of the know-how on how to manage the luxury brands. And they did everything by the book, by the luxury book. They had parties at the Upper East End. They launched in a big way with a huge mega decibel PR campaign, including Winfrey Opera show, where Sarah Ferguson showed up, and in the interview she was, actually wearing a Shanghai Tang. She gifted Winfrey a Shanghai Tang gown, etc., and big publicity. They had everything going for them. They were able to get the best of the real estate, the best of the PR machinery behind them, and the best of the models, best of the influencers, etc., etc. Collapsed. In 2 years, New York store closed down. And that marked the beginning of the problems for Shanghai Tang, which actually never stopped. By 2001, of course, David Tang, who was extremely buoyant, stepped down. And Richemont appointed Le Man, the CEO from Piaget, to take over Shanghai Tang. And he heralded a bunch of changes. So he tried to understand what was wrong with the strategy and actually toned down everything. The product language was completely changed from, they just did everything. They really did not pay any attention to the product at all. And they just put together whatever was easily available in a, like a very high luxury Emporio kind of scenario at Shanghai Tang. The one thing they did differently was to focus on a particular jacket, which was very, sort of flamboyant neon colors, the Mao jacket in, bright colors, which began to symbolize what Shanghai Tang was, or, those typical Chinese dresses in some of the very marked motifs that they did, which came to be known as cherry blossom dresses, etc., but very typical of Shanghai Tang. The rest was just a bit of everything that could be available in Hong Kong street markets, just 2 or 3 streets away. But people still paid the top dollar for it, except that in New York, it bombed, and bombed badly. So learning from that, he tried to make more sense of the product language, appointed for the first time a product director from Europe, from Sweden. The markets were redefined from all over the world to China first, Asia first. So they decided that, okay, instead of just trying to sell to everyone across the globe, we will first try to sell it in China and Asia. Made sense. The marketing budgets were not toned down, but the communication was toned down. And the brand generally became more discreet, all in the right direction. Now, in 2005, this was the result 4 years after. The sales, of course, increased, but Hong Kong store still contributed majority of the 12 million euro sales. So you can see after 11 years, 25 million euro for a luxury brand is pittance already. And one store still contributed most of it. So it just stalled. Despite big wholesale changes in 2001, nothing worked. As a result, 2011, it continued to struggle. In fact, Richemont put it on sale forever. But they could not manage to sell it until 2017. Anyway, 2011, Joanna left. 2012, even the Hong Kong flagship store shut down. 2017, they finally sold Shanghai Tang to an Italian group. 2018, just 1 year after, the Italian group sold it off because they couldn't make it work to a Chinese investor group. And in 2018, after all these years, the turnover was still just 30 million euros. The question, why did it fail to grow? And there are a lot of lessons here, a lot of lessons for all of us, anyone in creative industries. Imagine everyone, anyone, any one of us would have certain drivers, emotional drivers, the underlying emotional drivers that determine our likes and our dislikes, our tastes, our styles. And think of them as four big influence groups: tradition, emotion, evasion, and reason. I'll quickly explain. Tradition is really how we grow up, our culture, our upbringing, our heritage, our references as we grow up, the know-how, our the artisanal knowledge that we have, all that that we are exposed to, which is ours, is typically our influences, and that could be and is a very large source of inspiration for us, a very large source of our taste and style drivers. Of course, they evolve because our influences keep changing as we change our environment, where we work, where we live, our friends, our family, our partners. They all have influence on us. But yet, if we are 10 of us on a trip together to Peru, all 10 of us will have our antennas open to different things of what we are exposed to, thanks to a different heat map that each one of us comes with, as a a heat map of how different elements of tradition, emotion, evasion, and reason sort of influence us, affect us, drive us. Emotion is a very different influence group. Unlike tradition, where the community, the family is far more important, emotion is about the individual. The emotional influence groups are more things like pleasure, rebellion, seduction, exuberance, romanticism, but everything that is personal. And depending on the individual, depending on our own heat map, emotion actually plays a very, very large role in our determinants on how, and also our worldview and what we like, what we don't like. Evasion is a very interesting influence group. It has everything to do with other cultures. Evasion means literally escape. And it's what we are escaping to in our heads, even if not physically. This influence group is most connected with any kind of culture anywhere in the world. It is also most connected to nature. And it's also most connected to travel, also primarily because the driver is, I am here because I must be, but I'd rather be elsewhere. So even if I'm here, I'm constantly seeking, vibes and experiences of other cultures. And the other cultures could be just anything other than my own. And that's a very strong natural instinct as well. So you would mix up things, but you have a very open mind. You will also be very, very creative because your mind is open to so many different influences at the same time, etc. The last influence group is reason. Reason being, rational, really rational, and also something that is contemplative and reflective. So on one hand, it can be very spiritual. On the other hand, it can be very, very scientific, very cutting edge, very avant-garde. It can also be something very functional, very, very conceptual. Now, there were different customers. And here we are talking about pre-2001. The different customer views, actually even before and after, but so many different cultural segments, they all viewed Shanghai Tang differently. The promise that David Tang went into the market with for Shanghai Tang was something which is quintessentially Chinese. And the building block, it was foundational block that it was sitting on, was the 1930s Shanghai Art Deco. This was the stated aesthetic value that it stood for. That's why also the name Shanghai in the Shanghai Tang, because it was Shanghai was a seat of Art Deco in 1930s in Asia. But put yourself in the shoes of all these cultural groups. Hong Kong Chinese, for them, it was a very funny moment, 1994, 1997, 1999. 1997 was the time when Hong Kong was handed over by the British to China. So there was a newfound interest in the Chinese heritage. And yet, Hong Kong was as alien to China, or deep Chinese heritage. Because remember, there was, at that point in time, even the travel between mainland and Hong Kong was limited. And so it was as alien to Hong Kong Chinese, but a very curious kind of inquisitiveness of somebody of alien who's extremely inquisitive about a culture. So their view was very different. And of course, when Shanghai Tang came, a lot of wealthy Hong Kong Chinese adopted it. The mainland Chinese viewed it very skeptically, because for them, they were kind of connoisseurs. They said in fact, even until now, they keep rejecting Shanghai Tang as something that is alien, that doesn't belong to them. The expats living in Hong Kong and China were viewing it very similar to a Hong Kong Chinese, but with a little bit distance. They would buy it for a one-off party, but it was not something which was entering their lives every day. The tourists or visitors to Hong Kong or China, on the other hand, they would take back something because it was very much in news, and a little memento to carry back for gifts, etc. would be Shanghai Tang. People recognize it back home, so it's okay. They don't have to know. They're pretty much novice customer. Tourists and visitors to New York, on the other hand, when they opened up New York, didn't give a damn. They wanted to take a piece of New York back to their homeland. The local New York residents, again, they were curious, they bought into it, but as one of the critics said, that a Shanghai Tang jacket is better hung up on the wall than worn. So it's something exotic, it's something beautiful, but it's not something they can wear on an everyday basis. So it bombed because it served no cultural segment in New York, including the Chinese in New York, because they could find something similar in the China market. So on and so forth. So basically what we are seeing is that cultural lenses shut out or embrace certain influences very different to how you see them. So for example, the Hong Kong Chinese would be seeing it from a little bit of traditional lens, but a lot of emotional lens. Versus the expats or the visitors to Hong Kong or China would be seeing it purely from an evasion and evasion lenses, but something that's never going to enter into their daily lives, which actually brought the problem, because this is what we call the genesis of cultural distortions. It is very easy to stand out, but it's very hard to fit in. And this is the big challenge for any of us, any brand, anywhere in the world, to not just stand out, but also fit in. Because if you stand out to fit in, you have a winning formula. So we will see more as we go along. So in case of Shanghai Tang, why has this distortion occurred? We've talked about the multi-stage rocket. I'm not going to repeat it. In case of Shanghai Tang, it was a wrongful deployment of the rocket. They launched directly in the novice orbit, and we saw the pitfalls in that. And here you can actually see it live out. They went for hedonistic experience for projection as the value driver. Of course, it led to very quick success in Hong Kong. But remember, success breeds failure. And very early success, even more so. And we say that the first 3 customers are the 3 Fs: friends, family, and fools. Don't be fooled by them. And then what we end up doing when something becomes successful very early, particularly, is we attribute wrongfully the reasons to this success. We don't sit back and analyze success. And it was, of course, fed by the Richemont investment. So everything was on high. So we have done it, we have achieved it. Ended up being a kati patang, we talked about it. That you are flying in the novice orbit with no anchor, leading to a disaster in New York. Of course, something that they never recovered from, by the way. Because their value proposition before 2001 was 1930s Art Deco Shanghai, quintessentially Chinese, the muse being novices. And the delivery gap was that Art Deco, the only thing they harnessed from the Art Deco movement in Shanghai was the neon color. That's it. Zero attention to product design and curation. In fact, the product was not even important for them. Because they launched in the novice orbit, where the hedonistic experience and projection was all that mattered. But once again, it dials us back to the importance of exceptionalness in your product. After 2001, everything changed, but nothing changed. In fact, they changed their value proposition, and suddenly the Art Deco disappeared. The Shanghai Tang was lost. The Muse continued to be the novices. And the delivery gap was a lost positioning, completely confused, no definite aesthetic architecture, swinging like a pendulum, trying to see what may work. So there was attention to product design, but these two issues really caused the offering to be completely incoherent and continuing to be for the young Chinese, wealthy Chinese in mainland China. So the basic flaw, wrong Muse served a wrong value proposition. What interested me was to see what was right. Was there anything right in all these wrong or everything wrong? And actually, something was very, very right. And this brings us to this idea of national aesthetics. We'll talk about the appropriation a little bit later. You know, as Indians, what we have uniquely ours is our culture and our unique way of seeing our aesthetics. If you see any country, and if you think of brands from France, irrespective of any product category, you'll immediately associate it with refined chic. You think of Germany, you'll think of rigor and precision. You think of Italy, you'll think of flamboyance, seduction. You think of UK, you'll think of craftsmanship. You think of Japan, you think of conceptual. You think of Scandinavia, you think of conscious, rational, minimal. So actually, what David Tang got right was the idea of Chineseness. But his problem is his idea of Chineseness. And probably because he was also far removed from Shanghai, he was viewing it like a visitor himself. This is a photo I took when I visited Shanghai, and I was very curious about Shanghai Tang in particular. And this is a very, very famous theater, Cathay. And the Shanghai Tang flagship store happens to be, as we are looking at the picture, to the left on the ground floor. This ground floor of this theater. Very beautifully 1930s Art Deco building, beautiful building. So that's, I thought, was a very, very peculiar irony. His view of Chineseness was very personal, very Art Deco Shanghai, both very correct beginnings. The problem, he failed to convert a very strong and relevant Chineseness into a value proposition. He didn't know how to take this and articulate it. So all that he captured from the Art Deco of that moment was the colors. And in fact, he removed this whole Art Deco, which itself was very, very evasion, because you know as well as I do, perhaps even better, that Art Deco was a pastiche of three very different art movements, which themselves were influenced by different cultures. So it was a very strong opportunity to make everyone look at Shanghai Tang with the same lens and connect with it. But instead, he wanted to play a creative director when he was not. And that inability to translate the value proposition into a brand, into the right mix of product, communication, channel, and pricing. Art Deco, as I said, could have been made universally Eurasian and would have avoided any cultural distortion. In fact, these three different movements, Fauvism, Cubism, Ballet Russe, they all themselves come from different cultures. So everyone, even when it was born in France, were viewing it, it was attracting, and it traversed across the globe very quickly, thanks to everyone seeing it the same way. So that brings us to Indianness. What is Indianness? I would really like people to contribute here. Let's take a few minutes to hear from people.
So I think Indianness, for me, is a really complex category to define. I think I would rather believe that we are in the process of making and unmaking the category called Indianness. I think it has a lot to do with diversity, to begin with. Yeah.
Okay. We'll take two more. Who else had the raised hand?
So I think spirituality, diversity, and celebration, as I see, celebration of life. So that.
Okay. Well, actually, I'll make it very simple. We had a session, I remember, at IIM, and we had a house full, like 120 odd people, but we took 40 people to engage with us. And among those 40 were some of the luminaries. In fact, all of them were. But we had people like Shri B.V. Doshi, we had Rajiv Sethi, etc., etc. All of them highly, highly accomplished, who have carried the Indian flag in cultural space globally, won acclaim. And 40 voices had 72 answers. So, and I think the conclusion we actually came to, and it was a very, very interesting debate, discussion. And the conclusion we came to is what I'm going to repeat here. Indianness, as somebody said right up front, is diversity. Where does this diversity stems from? And this is the beauty of India, actually. The incredible diversity of cultures within what we call the Indian culture. There is nothing one about Indian culture, which means that there are millions of them. And I would go ahead and say there are actually, each one of us brings a unique Indianness to the table. Our own Indianness, which stems from our own upbringing, our own worldview, our own heritage, our own little cultures, micro cultures. And that, when harnessed, becomes a very unique point of view. You have something uniquely to tell to the world. And I think rather than looking for what the market wants, look for what you have to tell. And that, when harnessed correctly, actually touches people's hearts. And it can be in any form of product. It can be performing arts, It could be fashion, it could be jewelry, it could be food, it could be anything. But the reflections are so many possible. So many. The question, as we said, in case of Shanghai Tang as well, is does it fit in and does it stand out? It must tick both these boxes. Very difficult thing to do because, as we said, whatever you pick, there are already thousands, hundreds of thousands of options available to people. So please give anything you bring to the world a good reason to live. As a product, as a brand. If it fits these 4 questions well, is it your uniqueness? Have you harnessed it well? Does it fit in and does it stand out? I can assure you it will mean success, which means it must be really something very personal. You must have healthy dose of skills. You must have the passion. And there is no substitute to research. Not just on what you are doing and how to bring to the market, but also what choices people already have. But the more personal you make it, the more likelihood that you'll be okay. The more research you do, more authentic it would be. And one example I really like, something which I don't know, I'm sure all of you have very personal stories to bring to the market. But I like how Reena Singh of Eka, the brand, brings her very, very personal tales from growing up in suburban, rural environment in Haryana. And the clothing inspired by them, the clothing which is inspired by the entire upbringing, the little memories she carries. And how, therefore, even today, even when she's harnessing and, influences or inspirations from Kashmir or any other place, how she's able to view the same things authentically is her exceptionalness. So the moment you combine these 4 things together, you have a winning formula. And one such example that I've seen from very close quarters, I think Siddhant, if you are here today, has also contributed to part of the collection at Ikai Asai's first collection.
Yes, Anchal, I'm here.
Hey, hi, Siddhant. Yeah.
Hi.
So Siddhant did for Ikai a collection of table linen using Kala cotton from Kutch. But the important thing is that, these are very authentically Indian, built from very authentic Indian cultural stories, but something which would stand out and fit in from anywhere in the world. And sure enough, the success was quite phenomenal. Now, once you've done that, the very interesting thing is the cultural diaspora. And the cultural diaspora actually permits you to take your voice to a larger audience. Now, when I say diaspora, and I use the word cultural diaspora, is that the same thing might happen within India itself. There are so many different cultural diasporas spread all over the country that the same model can be used here as well as globally. This is from a more global point of view. This 2x2 matrix, I love 2x2 matrix, is you have rootedness on one axis and assimilation on the other. So the rootedness is to your home culture, your culture of birth. And assimilation is how assimilated or not you are to your current culture. So suppose you are an Indian living in the UK, the high on rootedness is something on how culturally rooted you are still to your own Indian culture, and how assimilated or how divorced you are from the British culture. Now, what it means is that if you are high on both, then you're very fertile to adopt and to refer. Adopt and refer both ways. So you will adopt the cultural products, cultural brands from both the cultures and would refer them to the respective communities, the respective cultures that you are exposed to. To your friends, you would be proud to display and share something you've discovered from India. And your friends will also likely connect with it because there is that adoption and reference ecosystem that gets established. If you are very low on assimilation of the local culture, and you are still very rooted to India, for example, then you're likely to be users of traditional Indian brands only. And it's likely that the local brands you are using for very functional needs. On the other hand, if you're very high on assimilation, but are completely uprooted from your Indian culture, you'll reject Indian. And here, you're indifferent. The point of this model is one very simple thing, that the route to spread of cultural goods is this box, which says adopt and refer. And the reverse diaspora effect also works equally well, where you have, for example, expats living in India. When they're going back, for example, to their home country, they're carrying back a piece of India, if they are also assimilated in India. Otherwise, they would sort of just skim over the top, live in their own little bubble and leave. So both ways, this channel, this box works very well to create your products, your brands, your audience within. The same model you can use depending on which box your product, your performance sits in actually. Which brings me to this question of cultural appropriation. I would like to ask what we mean by cultural appropriation. Let's take one or two answers. there is no pure culture. How do I even define what the Punjabi culture is? There is now what I'm trying to harness has sort of kind of a colonial hangover or colonial influence over it, which sort of dilutes the true culture. So how to do it, and who would it appeal to? Is that correct?
Somewhat. I mean, I'm not really blaming the colonial hangover. I'm just trying to gauge whether moving on with that is a better way to go about marketing yourself, or
I'll give you a very
leaving that.
small answer. Very, very small
Okay.
answer. Think of one of the most traditional garments that we as Indians consider, a sari.
Right.
A sari as it is worn today, and it's been worn as the last 1 century. We consider it as a sacrosanct Indian traditional garment. It was not worn that way until the colonial rule. In fact, the blouse and the petticoat came into being, and the way the sari was worn was extremely modern in the first half, in the early first half of the 20th century, because the women started to step out of their homes. And for many reasons, including modesty, etc., the wearing started to be very different. Sherwani, it has a very strong colonial influence. Where does it stop?
Right. And I mean, for the matter of fact, sari, in fact, I mean, it hasn't ever been a traditional costume in Punjab at all. Like, it's only very frequently, I mean, very lately, people have adopted to it.
For example, but sari is considered that universally, but you're right. But the answer is in the question itself. Tradition evolves as we speak. And in fact, a lot of questions around cultural appropriation also step in there, that cultural mixes are a reality and cultural evolution is a reality. My only answer to you, Siddhant, is think of your culture. Because that is the only thing that you'll be truest to, most authentic to. The rest you'll be second guessing.
Hi. So cultural appropriation for me, I think, works from the point of view of taking up a culture as more of a fad or a fashion rather than understanding the actual intricacy of it, and using it more as a mode of something which is nice and fun and easy, and not really understanding the background to it. In most cases, it is with minority cultures that happens. But I think even with majority cultures, this can absolutely happen, and it's a two-way process.
And pretty well articulated. Thank you. And principally, that's wrong, right?
Principally, yes. I have my doubts at certain points, which I think we can bring out in the Dara app when we debate this. But yeah.
Okay, here's my provocation. Okay, so I'm going to run through this, leave you with the provocation, and we can debate it on Dara. Okay. When we look at the dictionary, the Cambridge English Dictionary, it defines it, as you correctly pointed out, the act of taking or using things from a culture that is not your own, especially without showing that you understand or respect this culture. Now, this is perfectly understandable. But let's take an example. I'll talk about three different things, three different examples. And please tell me, for example, my first question is rock and roll. Rock and roll is probably one of the most popular, enduring performing arts form. Which culture do we associate it with? It's a question. Any hands?
There are no hands, but anybody would like to. American British is what people are typing into the chat box.
American. I mean, American culture, right? It's overwhelmingly American culture, American white culture associated with rock and roll. The answer is wrong. The answer is that the genesis of rock and roll comes from jazz, gospel, blues, swing. All of it is African culture. Is that cultural appropriation? Or is it cultural appreciation? Or is it cultural assimilation? We are actually conditioned with our own worldviews. And today, on one hand, we talk about cultural appropriation as being something principally wrong. And I'll come to the conditions in which, in my personal view, they would be wrong. But on one hand, we think of cultural appropriation as principally wrong. On the other hand, we are proud to call ourselves a global citizen. Which of them is right? Am I right to box myself in narrow cultural definitions? Or am I allowed, in fact, encouraged to understand and appreciate and assimilate? So it's a very fine line. When rock and roll probably began, it was born, perhaps it was something seen as having been stolen from the African culture. I leave that here. I'm not giving arguments either way, but I'm giving you one example. Let me give you another example. Chinese food is probably the most ordered, most eaten non-native food anywhere in the world. A dhaba in India would be selling multi-cuisine offerings: Mughlai, Chinese, continental. Is that cultural appropriation? And then let me give you another example. I don't know if how many of you know of Aurelio, an ex-Buddhist monk, actually from Austria, moved to India decades ago. Now lives in, has been living for a long while in Orwell, running an organization called Swaram, which does just the most exquisite sound instruments. He spent years and years traveling all over the country, particularly in the Himalayas, learning about the Vedas, about the Upanishads. Probably knows more about it than most of us Indians. Learned about all the kind of sound instruments that India has, can speak fondly about them and their cultural context. And now does sound instruments based on those cultural indicators. Is that cultural appropriation? So I'm just throwing these questions out, not giving any answer. But I'll tell you, there is two elements which, in fact, perhaps cross the boundaries. Number one, plagiarism, and second, denigration, which lead to oppression and discrediting of certain cultures. Now, plagiarism is universally accepted as a no-no. And it's got nothing to do with just culture. Anything that you plagiarize is incorrect. You have to give the right context, the right acknowledgements to what you are inspired by. It's okay to be inspired by. You'll only be inspired by something you appreciate. But not to give references is incorrect. To use it oppressingly or in a way to discredit is incorrect. Because as we began by saying, your truth is your cultural truth. So for every culture, there might be a different truth. And we have to respect those. But here is the beauty. Today, when we talk about provenance, when we talk about traceability, when we talk about transparency, there is an opportunity for anyone, anywhere, whether it be fashion, whether it's for a trend for one collection or not, it doesn't matter. As long as you are true to the provenance, you're honest to it, you're giving it the right acknowledgement, you can trace it back, you're transparent. I personally believe it's okay. And why do I say that? Because how do you box cultures? By which boundaries? As I said, aren't we supposed to be global citizens? Aren't we proud of that? Or are we defining it by a group of people? Are we defining it by the regions? Are we defining it by the countries? You know, there is something, a person that I was very inspired by. I have always been, he's no more now, but I've had a chance to be spending a lot of time with him personally. Edouard Glissant. He was born in Martinique in the West Indies to African slaves. And turns, of course, he studied and became one of the best known philosophers, poets in France, particularly talking about the French Caribbean culture and the creolization. He says this, I'm translated from French, is the border is this invitation to taste the differences. We as human beings are actually wired to enjoy, to reflect, and to celebrate the differences. And the border is actually an invitation, come and taste the difference. And then he goes on to say, there is actually not a border we don't cross. This, among many things he actually spoke about, was really deep and fundamental. And in this context, I would personally say culture cannot be appropriate. It's your culture, for God's sake. Nobody is appropriating your culture. It is uniquely yours. Yes, its manifestations might be appropriated or assimilated, it doesn't matter. But it can only be as long as you are not bringing your voice, which would be the most authentic. We see expressions of yoga, of Ayurveda all over the world. But why has that happened? Because we have not done anything about it. And when we choose to, we'll be the most authentic voice. When you choose to bring your most authentic cultural voice in whatever form, whether it is writing, whether it is performing, whether it is painting, whether it is fashion, whatever it is, nobody will beat that because that's the most authentic. You will understand those nuances to bring out those exceptionalness like no one else can. People actually love to taste the differences. And for guys, for all of us, this is the opportunity. People love to taste the differences. The world is ready for us. The question is very simple. Are you ready? And with this, I'd like to close. Thank you, guys.